Today, I'm breaking down Cry For Me by The Weeknd. This track is packed with killer techniques you can use in your productions right now. So let's dive in, but first, here's the example.
And I hope you cry for me, like I cry for you, every night for you. Take it easy on me, baby, cause I tried with you, saw my life with you, end of time with you. Now we're strangers and I hope that you still cry for me.
Okay, so we're gonna break this down, starting with the kick, just in isolation. Okay, so we've got two layers going on here. The first one is just our sub kick. It's nice and heavy. We've left a little bit of length on it just so we can really get that weight that we kind of want behind the 808. So we're doing some very basic EQ, taking out a little bit of 300 because it was a little bit kind of distracting for this particular kick, and bumping a little bit around that kind of 1K. And right after that, we're using smack attack just for that extra bit of punch. So right underneath that sub kick, we've got a bit of a stomp layer. And what we've done is ease in the fade from the front of this stomp, just so it doesn't clash with the sub kick. So this is what they sound like together. And then without. So it's just an extra bit of kind of air that it adds to the kick. The only other thing that it does is add an extra layer to the claps that we're going to look at a little bit later. So there's a few different layers going on with this kick, and the next thing that I've done is actually added a reverse kick every 8 bars or so. So this is what it sounds like. And reverse kicks like this can be such a great way to add, power and just sort of impact to a lot of those kicks, especially when they're a little more sparse like this. You really want it to have that weight whenever it hits. So adding something like a reverse kick can do wonders for your kick overall. It can also add some energy and impact to your 808s. So aside from those 3 layers, we have one more element to this kick, and that is another stomp, but it's a little bit brighter. So remember, whenever we're sort of layering things, we want to make sure that we're dividing the frequencies up so we're complementing each sound. So if we've got maybe a dull layer here, you want to have maybe a very bright one on top of that. So they're all layered and sort of fit really nicely into the frequency spectrum. So this is what it sounds like with that extra bright layer. And again, we're doing the same thing as the previous stomp. We're easing in that transient so it sits nicely with the other kicks. So the next element is actually really crucial for this song. We've got this snare pattern that sounds like this. Now you'll notice a lot of those snares sound a little bit thinner here and there, or maybe it sort of feels like it's kind of phasing out or something. It's actually intentional, obviously not the phasing, but what we're doing here is actually using dynamic EQ. So whenever the kick hits at the same time as that snare, we're ducking out any frequencies that might clash with the kick. And that can be a really great way to sort of layer instruments and make sure that they're sitting nicely in the mix. That's what we've done here, and that's why in isolation they might sound a bit funny. In context, this is it with the kick. Now, what The Weeknd have done here really, really well is use a lot of sort of vintage sounds, and you can tell that a lot of it's done on drum machines and sort of vintage instruments. So I definitely haven't done that as well here. I've sort of used what I thought would sound like a kind of good sample for this particular track. I think if you're going to use vintage sounds, you've got to take a lot of care and make sure that your sound selection process is really dialed in. That's why I've sort of not tried to completely imitate The Weeknd sound, because they do that very well. It's a very unique sound, and I've just sort of dialed in sounds the way I would typically do them. So I found a pretty nice sample here that fit, but remember that Weeknd sound, if it's something that you want to incorporate into your own mixes, the key to that is using vintage instruments, and even vintage emulations work really well too, and I'll show you some that I've used throughout this track. So underneath that snare, I've added some layers that were in the original track, but also that I thought just kind of helped it sit a little bit better, and these are some things that you can use in your own productions that kind of just help your snares mesh into the drum groups. So the first couple of things that were actually on the record, we've got this clap coming in every so often, so you'll hear the snare and then the clap underneath it. So we've got those sitting just on top of those snares. It just adds a little bit of interest, a little bit of dynamics, and be sure to, whenever you're layering something, nudge it to the left or right just to ensure that they're not sort of stacked directly on top of each other, because you don't want any phase issues or anything like that. And directly after that, I've actually got a really cool layer here that's just basically a sort of splash. It's almost like a wash of reverb. Again, it's not that dramatic in the record, but it's something that I think really sits nicely on top of claps and things like that. Now, after that, there are some percussions that actually were in the record that I could hear, and you can hear these kind of ride cymbals coming in every so often as well. And be sure to lengthen these out appropriately. Make sure that it's either reaching the end of the bar, or really listen to where those downbeats are and to where the sample actually stops. That's really, really important to ensure a clean performance of whatever you're sort of laying down. See, even something like this one, the reason we've shortened this is because of the next element that comes in on top, which is a little hat glitch. Now, I didn't program that in, I just used a sort of little snippet of a sample. Sometimes that can be really good. I'm all for sort of programming things in by hand, but occasionally it might just be a little element like that. If it's in a pack and it works, perhaps you can customize it slightly. I haven't done a whole heap here, but put a bit of soothe, a sort of low pass filter with a bit of a notch just to kind of help it blend in a little bit more. Of course, you'll have more control over if you actually input the data yourself, but that can be a nice little shortcut sometimes, especially with percussive instruments. So the next thing that we're going to look at are the 808s, and there are some cool things that are going on here that I think you can use in your own productions. So the very first layer that we've got is just our sub 808. And as you can hear, there's not much of a transient on this particular 808. A lot of producers like to just use the 808 and whatever transient kind of comes with it and sort of not really use much of a kick. I'm not really for that personally. I don't particularly like the result that I get when I do it. So I usually like to have a kick underneath just so I can really control that impact. And I personally like getting as much kind of punch as possible out of an 808. So I'll never kind of leave it in solo. I'll always have a kick underneath it, maybe a couple of layers just to add that texture and weight behind it. The next one we've got underneath it is more of a sort of sawtooth bass just to give it a little bit of body. And of course, we've used a very cool trick in Serum to ensure that it's not clashing with our 808. If you're using Serum, go to the pencil on each oscillator, go to Process and click Remove Fundamental. This will essentially remove the fundamental data from the sample, so it layers really nicely and you can just get the overall texture of that sample rather than just sort of stacking a bunch of different basses on top of each other. And of course, there's some strategic EQ that we've used as well, ensuring we don't have the same sort of amount of lows as the original sub, but that's a really cool technique you can use for your sub-bass layers. Not only that, but using layers like this can also ensure that you'll hear it on smaller speakers or, just in different environments. So it can be really cool. Right above that, we've got a similar synth, but just the octave higher. And then all together we get this. So you've got so much more depth to that 808 than if you were to just sort of leave a clean 808 there. So really, really nice. Play around with layering your 808s. So the only other bass that I've got here is just in the intro. It's just a kind of Reese bass that I found in Nexus. So this is what it sounds like. And we've just opened up the filter on that so that as it comes in, adds a little bit of interest, a little bit of suspense there. So there are 4 bass sounds. Now, in terms of their decay and release that you can hear, it's not just stringing across the entire bar. You've actually got it kind of easing in and out. I'll show you one more time. Just listen for the decay on this. On beat 3 and 4, it's decreasing in volume, and rather than using Serum to kind of play around with all the knobs and things like that, a really easy way to do that is just using the utility plugin, and I really like doing it this way because it just gives you so much control. And basically what we're doing is just dropping the volume, and you can choose exactly where that volume drops and exactly where it picks up again. So you don't have to necessarily play around with your attack, decay, and release. Of course, it's good to understand that stuff, definitely get to know it. This is a really cool way to just have that control over your ADSR. And on the record, you can hear around beat 3 and 4, it sort of drops and you can hear the drums a little bit more. So I'll just show you what it's doing with those drums. This is what it sounds like, and just have a look at the data where it's dropping out. So really nice and a really cool technique that you can use. Just about every DAW should have some kind of a utility plugin. Definitely take advantage of it because you can do so many things with it and just have that control rather than sort of dialing in your volume knob. Like here, I don't normally have volume automation happening. That looks like it was an accident or I tried something really quickly. I'll usually use the utility plugin so I still have control over my meters. And one last crucial thing on the bass group here, we've got Kickstart 2, which I love using. We've hooked it up to the kick and it's just sidechaining to that kick. We're just looking at where the data comes in like this, and we're just going to outline that. Any further can be a little bit extreme. You start to get these really intense dips, and it's not something that you want when you're creating a track like this. You want to just make sure that it mixes well and that the kick and bass is sitting well together. So it's more for mix purposes rather than creative. So moving on to the synths, we've got some vintage synths going on here. You can definitely hear that in the record. Emulating these can be a little bit tough, I think, without a plugin that is more or less dedicated to that synth. So whether or not they used a Juno, I'm not 100% sure, but this is one of my go-to vintage synths, and I managed to get something sort of similar. I definitely recommend having one or two vintage synths, at least a go-to, that you sort of can sprinkle throughout your productions and just add that kind of depth. Again, these are not preset choices I would typically make. We're of course emulating the Weeknd here, what they do really well, but that's another cool thing about the Weeknd. They're able to use these vintage sounds but make them sound super cool. So this is them in isolation. So I'll just show you the actual preset I played around with. I got this synth L Right Hoover, and basically I played around with the ADSR, some of the envelope, just to really try and get that sound as close as I could. I think the sound in the record is a little more weighty, it's a little heavier, particularly in its mix, but this is, I think, close enough. You're wanting some kind of a sawtooth type of sound, really paying attention to that decay. I actually made this track with a completely different ADSR setting, but as soon as I changed that, it changed the whole feel of the track, and it's these subtleties that really make the biggest difference. So really just try and be conscious of that. What is the length of each note, and how does that kind of impact the overall feel of the production? So you can definitely copy these settings. If you have something like Juno 106 or anything similar, you should get a similar result, even if you wanted to kind of recreate this in Serum. Underneath, I've got a higher octave. And I did this to match the stereo width of the original recording. So if you listen in headphones, you can actually hear the synth spreading from the middle to the left, which is how I kind of perceived it. So what I did to essentially compensate for that, or even imitate it, was pan to the left this higher octave, and it just sort of gave a similar effect. Of course, not exactly the same, but something similar. Right underneath this, we have a brass pad. And this sound is really interesting because it fools you into thinking that it's essentially the bass, which it sort of can act as. And this is really interesting because initially I thought this was the bass with a really sort of growly sawtooth over the top. But what it is a brass pad playing fifths in sort of a lower octave, and it sits in a place where I wouldn't typically put a pad like this. But again, that's what makes it really dark and really cool sounding, I think. So this is what it sounds like in isolation. And you could view this as a layer for your bass, or you could view it as something that kind of adds that mystique and darkness to the track overall. So that's sitting nicely with the other synths. This is just a Serum preset I got from Sphere by Echo Soundworks. Again, one of my favorite preset packs. Any vintage or modern preset in Serum, I'm typically using Echo Soundworks. I'm a big fan. If you're interested in checking them out, I've got some links in my description, but this particular preset is from a pack called Sphere that I picked up a while ago. So this sound is working really, really nicely for that. And all of the synths together, they sound like this. And lastly, I just added a few effects. The Weeknd do this really well. They're able to kind of transition into different sections without sort of using any downlifters or sweeps and things like that, and they still have that impact. And I think it has a lot to do with Abel's vocal, which kind of just drives you into each section, which is really cool. But what I've added here, just purely for fun, were a couple of risers and downlifters. The first one's just a downlifter that sounds like this. And then I've got an uplifter here. And you'll see in a second, I actually just reversed one of the other downlifters, which can be a really cool technique as well. Saves you looking for a different sample each time. If you've got a really nice downlifter, you can of course reverse it and see how that sounds. And right after that, we've got another riser on top of that. Again, a little bit brighter. We don't want to double the same sound, of course, or even something vaguely similar. Want to make sure that they're a little bit different. Another riser for this section here. Really nice, very simple, a little more airy. And then more of a kind of reverse cymbal here. Last but not least, a downlifter, which is more of a kind of breath sound. This is the one that we reversed right up here. And so that's more or less the instrumental. Other than that, we've got the vocal, which of course I took straight from the original just for the purpose of this video. And we've just got some very basic processing on it to help it kind of sit in the mix, bit of compression, bit of EQ, and a little bit of vocal rider. Right underneath that, I've got the lower octave, which sounds like this.
like I cry for you, every day for you.
So as you can hear, there's a bunch of different artifacts and things. I didn't really go through the effort of kind of cleaning it up and sort of running it through a bunch of different isotope things. I really just wanted it to kind of sit in this particular mix. And for that octave drop, I've used, again, one of my favorite plugins for vocals, which is Enterra's Throat. Really cool. Dropped the octave and just modeled the throat to lower that format as you would on similar plugins like this. And so if we put everything together, it sounds like this.
When I'm gone, and I hope you cry for me, like I cry for you, every night for you. Take it easy on me, baby, cause I tried with you, saw my life with you, end of time with you. Now we're strangers and I hope that you still cry for me.
Thanks for watching, and if you want me to personally coach you so you can start producing and releasing your best tracks yet, click the link below to book a free call with me. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.